Tuesday is election day, you may have heard. And as is the tradition in many congregations, the Sunday before Election Day is a time to reflect on how our deepest values can inform our participation in the democratic process. As Unitarian Universalist, one of our slogans is "Side with Love." So what might it mean then to vote on the side of love? One among many ways of answering that question is to turn our UU principles, they're on the back of your order of service, to turn them into a set of questions, either to ask candidates. You can literally do this. You can ask these things to candidates for public office, or use them as kind of a discernment about which candidates match my values. So things like, do your policy proposals reflect the inherent worth and dignity of every person? And if so, how? If elected, how will your everyday decisions demonstrate justice, equity, and compassion in human relations? How will you encourage acceptance and growth of one another across party lines? What insights have you learned from your own search for truth and meaning that will guide you as a political leader? What ideas do you have to improve our democratic process? Within our international community, how will you work toward a goal of peace, liberty, and justice for all, the goal of world community? Acknowledging our interdependence, how will your decisions impact our planet and future generations? And what specific actions will you take to accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions and build a diverse, multicultural society? There is no one right answer to these questions for all times and places, and there is room within the big tent of Unitarian Universalism for people supporting different candidates along different points of the political spectrum that are in line with these values. There are also ways of being outside of these values. In that light, if I had to summarize how UU congregations can best navigate the separation of church and state for times such as this, I would say that we can be political but not partisan. We can advocate for and against particular political issues and positions according to our values, but we cannot endorse specific candidates. That doesn't, however, preclude us from speaking prophetically according to our conscience, to hold politicians accountable for specific actions that they have or haven't taken. So on this Sunday before Election Day, I'd like to invite us to reflect on our political landscape through our UU fifth principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process, both in our society and in our congregations. From a fifth principle perspective, we lose our way as UUs if we devolve into a rigid, reflexive partisanship. But we act in alignment with some of our highest values when we act individually and collectively to defend the democratic process itself. So beyond the horse race of whether any given candidate wins, I'll leave that to the data nerds at 538. What I'm interested in is better equipping us to identify when democratic norms in our society are being undermined and the ways that we can protect our democracy, both for ourselves and for future generations. If there were more time, we could also consider the rising tide of authoritarianism globally, but arguably the most important first step, to be frank, is getting our own house in order. The democracy we have the most direct influence over is the one in which we can vote or can influence people around us to vote. And although there are examples of previous U.S. government officials undermining democratic norms, the reason I scheduled this particular sermon topic for this particular day is that it is important to be honest, clear, and direct about the unprecedented level at which our current president has regularly, openly, unapologetically showed disdain for basic constitutional norms. There is certainly not time this morning for an exhaustive list, but here's a distillation from a political scientist. Over the course of his campaign, candidate Trump broke just about every basic rule of democratic politics. He promised to jail his political opponents. He refused to say that he would accept the outcome of the election. He bullied the press, He invited a foreign power to sabotage his main competitor. He incited hatred against ethnic and religious minorities and promised to take unconstitutional action against them. As president-elect, he made baseless claims about widespread voter fraud. He denigrated the neutrality of independent state institutions, from courts to the intelligence agencies. He inquired about the status of planning permits for his personal building projects on official calls with foreign heads of state. He refused to create a blind trust for his private businesses. He repeatedly complimented the dictatorial leader of a rival power. As president, he has refused to resolve his substantial conflicts of interest. He has used the machinery of government to spread outright lies. He has tried to bar permanent residents from re-entering the country. He has rallied against, quote, so-called judges. He has dubbed journalists enemies of the people. He has threatened the owners of critical media outlets with higher taxes. He has undermined attempts to investigate his links with Russia by colluding with loyalist legislators, firing the directors of the FBI and publicly threatening him with secret recordings. This list, none of it, is about the success or failure of partisan political positions. It is about the person occupying the office of President of the United States having a reckless disregard for our democratic traditions and constitutional norms. To name yet another example from just this past week, when our president wanted to manipulate the media and the public in the days before the midterm elections, he decided to do it by threatening to void birthright citizenship laws by executive order, which would violate the 14th Amendment. As best I can tell, his motivation is not whether something is constitutional, but whether the ends justify his means. And the painful truth is such cynical ploys have proven to be pretty effective. One of the guides that I've found most helpful in thinking through what is merely a partisan difference and what is a threat to our democratic norms is Yascha Mounk. Monk was born in 1982 in Germany to parents who had immigrated to Germany from Poland. His mother is also Jewish. He earned a BA in history from Cambridge, a PhD in government from Harvard, and became a U.S. citizen just last year. He is currently a lecturer at Harvard. So he has a fascinating perspective on the world for such a time as this. I first learned about him in his regular podcast for Slate that's called The Good Fight. And this sermon is inspired by his most recent book. It was with Harvard University Press, titled The People versus Democracy. What he means about that title, the people versus democracy, how could that even be, right? Isn't democracy people power? How do we have the people versus democracy? Well, ironically, the people of a democracy can ironically pervert democracy by democratic means. Democracy is from those ancient words, demos, the people, and kratia, meaning power. So democracy is people power. But what if the people democratically choose to use their power to cede power to a dictator? What do we do with that? For us Unitarian Universalists, one can make the argument that our fifth principle, commitment to democracy, means that there should actually be guardrails to prevent such choices. From this perspective, any act that would permanently undermine a democratic check on power would itself be anti-democratic and therefore out of order. Turns out our founders knew about this and put some things in place. We'll talk about it. That being said, the truth is that democracy alone is definitionally nothing more than a set of binding electoral institutions that effectively translate popular views into public policy. One might rightly add that we, the people of the United States, have additional values beyond a commitment just to democracy. Values that protect the rule of law, that guarantee individual rights, such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of association, for all people, not just people we agree with, not just for us, but for everybody, including ethnic and religious minorities. But these values, they are actually not democratic values. They're liberal values. Democratic values are just whatever the majority votes for, right? Liberal values say that no matter who wins an election, we value these things. A liberal, not like the modern capital D Democratic Party, but classical 18th century Enlightenment liberalism on which our nation was founded. As we discussed last week, classical liberalism is from the Latin root libere, meaning freedom. It's about protecting essential freedoms for all people, irrespective of how a given electoral majority votes in any given election. Said more directly, sometimes the people use their power to democratically vote for illiberalism, values that violate individual rights and liberties. The good news is that we, the people of the United States, have come together to form a union that is not merely a democracy. We are a liberal democracy in the vision of our founders. Our founders created a political system that is not only democratic, but liberal and democratic, one that both protects individual rights and translates popular views into public policy. In that sense, and this couldn't be more important, but in that sense of being a liberal democracy, George W. Bush is as much as a liberal as Barack Obama. Ronald Reagan is as much a liberal as Bill Clinton. But when any president, irrespective of political party, violates basic liberal values, our democracy, our liberal democracy, is threatened. Joshua Monk calls the two common alternatives to liberal democracy: democracy without rights and rights without democracy. Democracy without rights is the tyranny of the majority that our founders wrote about and deeply feared. So you keep your democracy, you keep doing, but you have what the majority wants, which is to often stampede over the rights of minorities. Our founders thought that core individual freedoms like speech, religion, the press, association must be protected irrespective of what any temporary majority of the voters wanted in the heat of any given electoral moment. Rights without democracy is when human rights and civil rights are maintained, at least in the moment, but factors such as big money and voter suppression dominate the political process to the extent that the will of the people is undermined. We currently have both problems in the United States today. I will address the issue of rights without democracy more fully in late January in a sermon titled, "We the Corporations." For now, I want to keep our focus on a possible future of democracy without rights that could, in turn, itself devolve into a dictatorship of neither democracy nor rights. That's what we really don't want to happen. Those are those red lines. One common path to democracy without rights, into manipulating people power, into empowering politicians who would seek to undermine individual rights and democratic norms, is called populism. I'll hasten to add, of course, that not all populism is bad. Indeed, populism and emphasizing the importance of the people over and against an elite few can be quite healthy for the body politic. So it would be more accurate to say, perhaps, that the most common path to democracy without rights is demagoguery. Notice that a lot of these words, democracy, demagoguery, they all come to us from the ancient Greeks. We've been thinking about these things for a long time, since that initial heartbed of democracy. Demagoguery, democracy, they begin with that same Greek word demos, meaning people. But a demagogue adds in that Greek word agogos, meaning leader. And demagoguery has the sense not of democratic people power, but of a leader who turns a reasonable we, the people seeking to be our best selves, to follow the better angels of our nature, it turns that we, the people, into a mob. We have seen this approach with Donald Trump here in the U.S., with Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom's vote to Brexit, to exit from the Democratic Union, with Marie Le Pen in France, with Franck Patry in Germany, and others around the world. Brazil is having its own similar problems right now. Despite important differences, there is a pattern of rhetoric among these politicians that the solution to the most pressing problems of our time, they will tell you, is really quite straightforward than what the political establishment will tell you, will have you believe. And if you vote for me, I will be your voice. The voice of the people will prevail, and the reason for popular discontent will quickly vanish, and America or Great Britain or France or Germany or Brazil will be made allegedly great again. The truth is that politics and life are much messier and more complicated than that. So to gain and maintain demagogues and to distract from their own failures, demagogues tend to blame racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. It's their fault that we can't have nice things, they tell us. as well as and they also tend to blame political institutions which inhibit the demagogue's power. Together, this results in a shift toward democracy without rights, the tyranny of the majority, whipping up the passions of an electoral majority to take away the rights of the few, and it is often too late that the majority realizes that their individual rights and liberties, once those minorities are out of the way, are soon the next target. First, they came for the Jews, right? And the story continues. History shows us time and again that when rights, liberties, and civilities are disrespected, previously unquestioned norms quickly deteriorate. President Trump has repeatedly crossed what many people called red lines. But as soon as we now look back at them, that long list that I just read through the rearview mirror, they start to appear like yellow or green lines. Nevertheless, I do not think the takeaway is despair. If the year 2016, if the election of Donald Trump, if the passage of Brexit taught us anything, it is that the future is uncertain and the experts do not always make accurate predictions. There remain many reasons to hope, to mobilize, to organize, to make our society less susceptible to demagoguery. Among the many tasks is to decrease wealth inequality. When there's a great wealth gap, demagoguery is particularly effective. We need to increase funding for universal access to high-quality education through at least college and vocational training to equip people with the critical thinking skills and ability to get a job that helps, again, not create an easy ground for demagoguery. We need to reform our internet and social media platforms to be responsible against misinformation, propaganda, and hate speech. At its core, the issue is not partisanship, but patriotism. Defending the norms, the rights, and freedoms that are the heart of our liberal democratic tradition as created by our founders. Speaking for myself, I rarely agreed with political policies of the late Senator John McCain, but we heard so many testimonies at his funeral of the many times that he courageously put country before party. That's what I mean by it's really at its heart about patriotism, not partisanship. As I move toward my conclusion, I'll give you one more example, this time from Unitarian Universalist history, of defending our democracy as much or more as patriots than as partisans. History reminds me that as challenging as our current political climate is, it is not, at least not yet, anything like as terrible a time in our nation's history as the Civil War. And I'm reminded further that in 1861, at the beginning of the U.S. Civil War, our Unitarian forebear, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., published an unofficial fifth verse to our national anthem that particularly wrestles with the threats to our liberal democracy that come not from an external foe, but what happens when the threat to our democracy comes from within. Some of the lyrics that have made this verse newly poignant are, if a foe from within strikes a blow at her glory, down, down with the traitor that dares to defile the flag of her stars and the page of her story. Or toward the end of this verse, Holmes envisioning the end of slavery writes, by the millions unchained who our birthright have gained. So finally living into that promise, that birthright of our nation, we will keep her bright blazon forever unstained. And although it is customary to stand or to kneel for verse 1 of our Star-Spangled Banner, for this fifth unofficial verse, I'll invite you to remain seated. Open your hearts, open your mind. How do you feel called for such a time as this, with just days, hours remaining before the next election, to participate in our fifth UU principle of the democratic process?